My first name is David, and my last name is Middleman, Mitteleman, and I'm the CEO of Othram, Othram. We're based in Houston, Texas, really the Woodlands, which is about 30 miles north of Houston.
Okay, so
Uh,
in this case, her remains were found in a suitcase in San Diego Bay in
yeah,
1973. And
so
for 50 years, she was unidentified until they exhumed her body in 2020. And
yep.
what kind of work went, pick it up from there, and what did you have to do to identify her?
So in 2020, when the San Diego Medical Examiner's Office, they did, as you said, an exhumation. They started with some, conventional DNA testing. They use what's called STR testing, or some people refer to this as CODIS, and they built a DNA profile. It consists of 20 markers, and you can use those 20 markers to search CODIS. And if someone's in CODIS and you collect 20 markers from a crime scene or from forensic evidence, then you can make a match and say this person's in CODIS. The challenge for these unidentified remains is that CODIS is primarily populated by forensic casework from suspects. So it's usually criminals that are in CODIS. You get convicted of a crime and then you end up in CODIS. So victims, unidentified human remains, are usually victims. They're almost never represented in CODIS. And so you can do the proper testing and not get a result. So at this point, STR testing hasn't produced an identity, but they've got DNA because they've exhumed her body. And so this is where, the kind of work we do comes in. They actually went and got funding through NamUs. And just as a quick backdrop on that, NamUs is this program that the U.S. government runs. It's run by the National Institute of Justice, and NamUs catalogs all the unidentified human remains in this country. And there's probably 14 or 15,000 folks right now in the NamUs database that are unidentified. But this is a gross underestimate. Not everyone's required to report to NamUs. And so my guess is there could be as many as 50,000 unidentified folks right now in the country. But anyways, 15,000 in this database. And so NamUs has been cataloging these cases, but also provides the resources and funding to work them. So when San Diego came up short with the STR profile matching to an identity in CODIS, they went to NamUs, and NamUs funded the necessary work for them to take the next step. That next step involved sending forensic evidence to us. And so they literally sent a piece of the skeletal remains to Othram in Houston. And what we did is we built a DNA extract. We extracted DNA from these remains. We've worked with remains that are over 100 years old. So even though these remains were 50 years old, this is actually not unusual for the kind of work we have to do at Othram. And we built a DNA extract and used a process called forensic grade genome sequencing. And this is a specialized test. There's a lot of kinds of DNA testing, just like there's a lot of writers and a lot of journalists and everything else. This is a specific kind of DNA testing exclusively for forensic use. And it takes into account kind of the complexities you see in forensics: old DNA, degraded, chemically damaged, not a lot left of it, probably mixed up with bacteria and other non-human sources. And so we use this forensic grade genome sequencing. We built an exhaustive profile, and from there, our forensic genetic genealogy team used that profile instead of to match exactly in a database like CODIS to find any relatives. Right? Are there any distant relationships that we could uncover that would give us clues to her identity? So that's kind of the high level process that we had to follow to generate leads that the law enforcement could use to trace back her identity.
People are familiar with the Golden State Killer case, and I think generally they're familiar with genetic genealogy, tracing back relatives. What relative were you able to locate with this individual? Because my understanding from the police department is she had very recently immigrated to the United States from Portugal. So did that present any problems for you?
Yeah, it sure did. And this is a really interesting case because you'll hear people, that have a familiarity with genetic genealogy and forensic genetic genealogy, and they're going to say, look, the databases are biased towards Northern Europeans. So if you're not Northern European or you're not American, it's not possible to track back an identity. And the truth is, it is challenging if you're not Northern European. You're likely to be less represented. And this person, she has ancestry that's European, but as you probably know, she has Portuguese ancestry, so it's not necessarily the most well represented in the database. And then the second challenge that you're aware of is that she also was a recent immigrant. So what did we do? So we were able to trace back a distant relative that was from New Jersey. And in speaking to these folks, none of the people that we had mapped back to in New Jersey were incredibly close relationships. Where we're talking about, like, in the range of fourth to sixth cousin. So this is very distant. I don't even know who my fourth cousins are. So this is quite a distant relationship, fourth to sixth cousin. And as these people began to talk about this person and the case amongst their community, um, believe it or not, there was some folks that recognized some of the details of the case and actually said they might have remembered somebody. And so this led to some additional investigative work. Law enforcement was able to make contact with a handful of folks and talk back through this knowledge that people had about a person that they remember that had then had vanished. And this little by little allowed investigators to piece back some clues that led them to a possible family that she may be from. And then it was confirmatory DNA testing that then established that she, in fact, was the person that was being spoken of in these circles. And so this is an important thing. I think it's a really interesting case, and it's an important thing to share with folks, which is that sometimes you'll do genetic genealogy, like you mentioned some of these popular cases, and you center on a specific person or a close relative. But very often the genetic genealogy is just kind of a way to generate leads. Sometimes it's more than genetic genealogy. In this case, it was a combination of biogeographical ancestry, understanding her historical origins, and then that combined with distant relatives who knew something about what it might have happened to this person. I'm not even sure it's clear how she ended up in San Diego. I think that investigators know that she had started from New Jersey, and then somehow she ended up in San Diego. And I think they're still trying to kind of figure out what happened and who may have been responsible for her death. So just being able to connect with a little bit of specificity the historical origins of someone, and then to connect with other folks that might have known her in the time frame, in this case, was enough to generate some clues that after they were vetted and confirmatory DNA testing was applied, they were able to get to who she was.
Okay, do you have any idea how long it took you to identify the distant relative and track it back to? I know she had a couple children, so I assume that those two children, those two daughters, maybe had to do DNA tests. But can you tell me, like, how long it took you to actually find this relative in the New Jersey area?
It didn't take us a long time to build the profile and find the relatives, but there was a good amount of time that was spent having the conversation, connecting with folks, and then law enforcement, working side by side with law enforcement to basically reach out to these folks as well. Um, just to give you perspective, like we started the case, we received the evidence for this case in the fall of 2020, and so it gives you a little perspective. We built that profile, and early this year we were beginning to chase leads, and one thing led to the other, and we were eventually able to center on someone. So I think if you consider the time frame in which this case was unsolved, right, half a century, it was pretty quick. But if you think about it in terms of, like, being able to find a close relative and immediately resolve the case, it took a while. The case was end to end resolved in less than a year, though, right, from the time that we got the evidence.
Okay. Do you happen to know how the person that you matched up, the third or fourth cousin, I think you said, had they done like a 23andMe test, or had they been in trouble with the law and had their DNA in there? What,
Yeah,
what?
it's a good question. We don't search law enforcement databases, so I don't think this person was in trouble with the law. We search genealogical databases that are consented for law enforcement use. So what happens is there are folks that have done consumer testing with one commercial company or the other, And should they put their data in one of these public databases, and should they do that plus also consent to law enforcement search, then if they come back as a even distant match or distant connection to an unidentified person or some kind of forensic evidence, then they'll be included in that kind of search results that is generated as a consequence of searching a profile in these databases. And so this person would have done consumer testing at one point or another, had uploaded their data to one of these databases, and had selected the consent option for using their search results, sorry, their profile in a law enforcement search. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Do you happen to know which service they used?
I don't know what service they used. It would probably be something that our lab knew. I don't know which service they used, but all
Okay.
the services generate largely the same kind of profiles. So I think some people prefer this company versus that company, but they're generating roughly the same data, and so it doesn't really matter. What matters is that they've uploaded it and they've consented. If they don't upload it or they don't consent, then their data would not be included in a search.
And is it accurate to say it was a third or fourth cousin? Do you know that for sure?
It was actually in the range of fourth to sixth cousin. So if it
Fourth
was
to
a third
sixth
cousin, this would
cousin.
be a lot easier of a case. It was more distant than fourth cousin, and less distant than sixth cousin.
Very
That's
good.
the relationship.
And are you able to say, was it one of the two daughters who did a DNA test to confirm that it was her mother?
I'm not sure who did it. I could look into it. I don't know who actually ended up doing the confirmatory test.
All right, maybe you could email me that. I know that she had two daughters and she was married. The detective told me that she believes that the family knew that she was going to be leaving for some reason, and but they still don't know how she ended up in San Diego.
Yeah, I mean
Um,
it's pretty shocking, right? It was 50 years ago, and she basically makes a cross country trek. So I think there's a lot of questions to chase down. The good news is there are clearly people that remember her, even a half a century later, and which is how we got to her identity. So I'm very hopeful. We've not had direct discussions with these people, but I know law enforcement's engaged with many of them. So I certainly hope they get a little bit more clarity on what happened.
okay. Why is it? I'm going to turn myself on again. Why is it that law enforcement comes to you for this rather than
So
trying to do it themselves?
Well, so that's the thing is, it's kind of in the details here. So genetic genealogy is something that is not new. It's been around for almost 25 years, and in some form or another. And so you're right. Like, could an investigator pick up genealogical skills? Of course they can. And in fact, some agencies employ their own genealogists and they do amazing work. The challenge is in building a DNA profile, because remember that everyone in the database, they've taken a fresh buccal swab collection and they've deposited, within a week or so, their fresh DNA, high quality, high quantity, into this database. But what we're trying to use as our search criteria is these, exhumed skeletal remains from 50 years ago. And so the challenge is that you have to be able to build a DNA profile that has a lot of markers. And I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of markers. And they got to be the right markers. If you select markers that have noise or error or not complete, then the number one problem in genetic genealogy is that you're going to have what's called a false negative problem. You're not going to see the relationship. And I just told you we were looking for someone that ended up being in the fourth to sixth cousin range. That's a very distant relationship. And so law enforcement comes to us because we can build, really powerful, ultra sensitive DNA profiles that can detect very distant relationships. And again, it's a combination of being able to work with almost any kind of forensic input, the oldest bones, the most degraded sort of thing, and it works fine. Number two, we get hundreds of thousands of markers. And number three, we're really, really good because we've sequenced more crime scenes. We've DNA sequenced more crime scenes than anyone on Earth at this point. We're really good at building models to distinguish noise from real variation that describes that person and their family and so on. And so the ability to generate profiles that are high performing and ultra sensitive, that is why law enforcement comes to us. Now, in addition, so happens that this is all we do. And so we've doubled down on building a method specifically for forensics. We do nothing else. We don't do medical or consumer or research testing. And so we're also a trusted partner in that we operate in a forensic environment. We've got chain of custody. We have all the documentation they're accustomed to wanting to receive alongside of that. So we don't outsource any part of the process. It's fully end to end. So they're getting the best possible profiles, even if the input isn't really great, even if the forensic evidence is challenging, and they're getting something they can then use in a genealogical search that provides them that apples to apples comparison. So, and hopefully that's not too much, but that's really the short of why they want to work with us.
Okay, I'll try to wrap this up, but I'm just curious. And I think most people in the general public think that if you exhume a body, there's going to be, even if it's 50 years old, there's going to be no problem in getting a full DNA profile because, yeah, the bones are decomposed, but you have a lot of the body there. But you're telling me that's not necessarily the case. There can be problems with getting a full DNA profile from a body that's 50 years old.
Yeah, sometimes the DNA is really degraded. Sometimes the remains have been treated with chemicals. Sometimes they're treated with heat. Those things are all terrible for DNA. You have to also remember, like, as bones age, right? There's other stuff on those bones, not just human DNA. There's bacteria that can eventually overrun and be more represented than the human DNA that was originally there. I mean, the bones themselves are not made of DNA. It's in the interior of the bones, the marrow, other pieces that have pieces and scraps of DNA. That material degrades over time, and it could become displaced largely by non-human DNA. When you do DNA sequencing and the kind of work that we do, this kind of a very sensitive measurement of lots of markers, you're reading everything. So you're reading all the DNA that's there, not just the DNA from that person. And even a little bit of degradation and damage, whether due to the exposure to the environment, being underground, whether chemical in nature, these kind of things can also, like I said, they can alter the ability to properly read that DNA. So those are the kind of challenges you face. Now, do you face more challenges in a crime scene where there's like trace evidence left of a suspect? Of course. So I think human remains on average can be more manageable than, say, trace evidence of a suspect. But in any case, you don't really know until you crack the case open what the challenge is going to be. And that's kind of the point. The value that we bring to law enforcement is that we've seen pretty much everything. And you can't look at with your eyeballs one bone and another and say this one's going to be hard, this one's going to be easy. You don't know till you get in there. And what we offer people is basically a robust and kind of equitable experience. You get an equitable outcome regardless of what's coming in. So you can send us the best bone and the worst bone, and you'll get roughly the same result.
Okay, very good. Just very quickly, this woman was an unidentified murder victim, so I'm not sure she would have had a really expensive casket or exactly how she was buried, probably in a public cemetery somewhere. But you were able to get a full DNA profile, so congratulations to you. Just out of curiosity, can you get DNA if she had been cremated and only her ashes were left? Can you still get DNA from that?
That's a good question. So heat is a very damaging thing for DNA. And if someone is cremated, there's two things that happen during cremation. One is that you're heating up the remains, but the other is that before the ashes are transferred to the urn, they filter out. Not everything breaks down during the cremation process, so they'll discard anything that isn't fully ash. And so, if you're asking, can you get DNA from ash? This is something that is very unlikely to work.
Okay.
However, we have worked situations where people have been burned in a fire, right? They're not completely reduced to ash, and in that case, it's challenging, but it's possible. And we've had success identifying folks that have been victims of explosions or house fires. But to truly reduce someone to ash, I think is really to eliminate the possibility that you'd be able to get a productive DNA profile.
And if this woman's relatives had not submitted their DNA to a publicly available database, and you wanted to go to CODIS to see if any relatives were in CODIS, does law enforcement have the ability to do that on distant relatives, or how would you do that?
So this is a good question. Law enforcement searches CODIS before they come to us. Now here's the challenge. With CODIS, you're looking at 20 markers. So let's say you and I are brothers. If you and I are brothers, we'll probably share half of our DNA. And so when you have 20 markers to compare on, that means I may have 10 markers in common with you only. If you're my cousin, you won't even see it. So the problem with CODIS testing is that the number of markers that you're afforded limits the kind of relationship you can measure. With CODIS, you can measure a parent-child relationship or a sibling relationship or yourself, obviously, and that's it. So if it's not a self relationship or a parent, child, or sibling, then you really are constrained in what you can learn from CODIS. And I will point out, CODIS was never designed for human remains. So you may say, well, this is a flaw in CODIS, but by design, CODIS wasn't intended for that. CODIS was built to catalog convicted perpetrators of crime so they could be linked to other crime scenes in the past or in the future that they could be involved with. So CODIS is the best tool available until now to sort out unidentified remains, but it wasn't intended for that. And so that's why it doesn't work as well. And when CODIS doesn't provide that answer, we do our piece. Now, here's the magic is at the end, we've identified someone. We think we know who she is. Then you can use CODIS to do a direct comparison between the profile of the unidentified remains and ideally the person, or in this case, if the person's deceased, a close relative. And now you can use that to confirm the result. So STR testing, CODIS, this is very good at confirming identity. It's just not good at finding someone if they're not already in a database. And maybe the last analogy I'll give you, but I know that you're running over on time, is you can think of CODIS like a fingerprint. If you touch an object and I know what your fingerprint looks like, I can tell you if you touch the object. I can match the fingerprints up. But if I have a fingerprint of an object, I can't like search for the nearest fingerprint. Like, is a fingerprint just tells you I touched it or I didn't touch it. That's kind of how CODIS works. So CODIS and STR testing is like a DNA fingerprint. That's why they call it that. It just tells you if you were there. The kind of testing we do is much more approximate. And there we're saying, who is the nearest relative? We're all genetic family. You're probably my cousin too. We're probably ninth cousins. I don't know. Um, I don't know where you're from, but we're probably cousins somewhere in the history of mankind. And so we all share DNA at some point in ancestry. And the question is just how distant are we? And the more relatives you can find, even if they're distant, the more likely you can piece together a common ancestor. And then from there, work the ancestry down to the present and look who are the common folks that are related and hope that one of those might be the person that you're looking for.
Very good. Thank you, David, for taking the time with us, and good luck to you. Keep up the good work.